So we start off with the title of this talk, which we've called Extraordinary Women of Sussex, and we did that on purpose because that's mainly what Val has researched into. The people that she's studied have not only been interesting to us as an LGBT community, but they've also been local history, and it's a very interesting combination of the two. So we called it Extraordinary Women of Sussex, but knowledgeably, because that title then can also include Val, because she's an extraordinary woman of Sussex, and we're here to celebrate all she's done over the last 20 years. All the research that Val has done over this time has actually been encapsulated in 2 published works. This was the first. It was published, I think, originally in 2002, and it's been out of print for quite a long time. One of the reasons that I'm mentioning it now is that it's just gone into its 2nd edition, and I happen to know that Val has a few copies around her today. So if you by any chance don't have a copy of this book, I must tell you that it's absolutely fascinating in terms of the history of Brighton, but also the history of women, because it starts in 1898 when 2 young women called Helen Boyle and Mabel Jones, newly qualified from the London School of Medicine for Women, and part of the very first generation of women who were ever allowed to qualify as doctors. So the first lady doctors, if you like, arrived in Hove in 1898 and set up a practice there. It was absolutely revolutionary in its time, and amazingly, not very long after that, another young woman called Dr. Louisa Martindale came and set up her surgery in Brighton. And those were the beginnings of what by the 1920s were 2 hospitals, not just one but 2, in Brighton and Hove, serving the needs of women and children particularly. So it's a story of pioneers, and I suppose in a way I could have made a case, couldn't I, for talking about it in terms of LGBT history, though we never know. But certainly the very large majority of those early qualified professional women didn't marry. Very often, like the women in our story, they lived faithfully together with another doctor or another nice lady friend for most of their lives, and left them in their will. And so we can only just think about what their relationships could be, because after all, it wasn't going to be a lot of point in going through all that hell and high water to qualify in that way to practice professionally and then have to give it up on marriage. So we'll just say to ourselves, we'll never know. And one of the things about Val as a historian, I've got to say, and she's different in this way from other LGBT historians, is she doesn't jump to conclusions. If there isn't any proof, she says there isn't any proof, and we must leave it to our own imaginations. So that's the hospitals book, and that's all I'm going to say about that, really, except that it is now in print again, and I do urge you, if you're at all interested in any of those aspects of history, to get a hold of a copy. Leslie said to me the other day, Val's the only person I know who, when you read her work, it sounds like her talking. I didn't know Val back in 2002 when she wrote the hospitals book, but it surely does sound like her talking. And those of you who know her will know exactly what I mean if you read it. Now, this is the 2nd book that Val published. That was much more recently, in about 2016-17. But it was the upshot of a long piece of research which she had embarked on when I first met her. And it was while she was researching the life of Tupi Lowther that I came to know her, and also to know the extraordinarily dogged and detailed and really admirable way in which she goes about her research. Tupi Lowther was certainly somebody interesting to this collection of people, and she moved in circles that, well, you'll know some of her friends. So let's have a look at her. That's a very early portrait of her, I think teenage probably. She was born in 1874, so a long time before it was acceptable for women ever to cut their hair, and I think she appears there in what was later to be known as New Woman costume, and probably was as near as the Victorian period allowed you to get to a collar and tie. But there she is, looking thoughtful, and I always think, just waiting for life to happen. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. I said she was born in 1874. She was the youngest of 3 children. and she died in 1944, so she did quite well, really, lived through 2 wars. And it's her work in the First World War that we're mainly going to talk about today. She was actually christened May, and this is something that Val discovered. One of the reasons that Tupi Lowther's story had disappeared from history was because those people who did occasionally stumble across her thought she was called Barbara, and there was a Barbara Lowther, about whom very little is known, so that was the end of the story. Barbara Lowther was a different generation and lived in a different place, and it was only Val's careful uncovering of the facts that brought to light the fact that May Lowther, Tupi, was somebody entirely different, and she's put some quite serious historians right on that subject, which gave us great satisfaction, didn't it? So why is she called Tupi? It was a childhood name. We don't know what it stood for, but in my mind, it fits in very well with the need for all butch lesbians to have a kind of gender-free non-name. She was never going to get on called May, was she? Let's face it. It wasn't going to suit her. Her father, whose name was Francis William Lowther, was the son of Viscount Lowther, who was later the second Earl of Lonsdale. So you may say she was born into the upper echelons of society. The only problem was that her father was the illegitimate son of the aforementioned Earl. So she wasn't quite as privileged or as able to tell people about that as she would have been otherwise. Her life's of interest to us for all sorts of reasons, because she had a lot of Sussex connections, ended up living in Sussex, because she was extraordinary in the work that she did in the First World War, and because she was really extremely queer. So let's have a little look at some of her Sussex connections. You'll recognise that. That's St Albans in Hove, and that's where her mother lived in the later part of her life and died. Keep going. Here's a lovely, lovely house in Montpellier Crescent, which still stands, which is where Tupi's sister lived and later died. Tupi's sister's quite an interesting character, actually. There she is. She never married either, but we don't know anything about her, except that she was a very, very active amateur actor. And no doubt that's what she's doing in this picture, being some kind of Saxon peasant, I should think, from the look of it. But we know very little about Amy, except that she was the eldest of the 3. The middle child was a boy, who is Claude. Now, Claude is also quite well known because he was Lieutenant Colonel Lowther, who raised a battalion of infantry to go and fight in the latter part, fairly early part of the First World War in Belgium, and they became known as Lowther's Lambs, and you may have heard of them because they were lambs to the slaughter, and they were pretty much wiped out in a battle called the Battle of the Boar's Head. And they didn't even get a lot of fame for it because the very next day after that was the Battle of the Somme, which everybody has heard about. So Lowther's Lambs went down in not terribly glorious history. He wasn't there at the time. He actually had to resign his commission because of ill health just before the battle, so he didn't get killed, and he retired to, I think that's actually him at Hurstmonceux Castle, but let's see Hurstmonceux Castle. He lived there. So he was all right, and you can go and visit Hurstmonceux Castle, as we have done on several occasions, because one of the things about helping Val with her research always means you have to go to a lot of places to make sure they're still there and what they were really like. So Hurstmonceux is one of the places we've been. And you may feel from what I've said, that, and when I've told you a bit more about his sister, that actually his war record was not as glorious as hers. So let's go back to Tupi herself. There she is. In about 1898, I think, so about 20. As you can see, dressed for fencing. And she was an extremely well-known and extremely successful national level fencer in her youth. And that was really how she was well-known in her life until 1918 came, because she was a remarkable sportswoman of her generation. Now, it's interesting about fencing because it was one of the very few things before the turn of the 20th century where it was just about okay for women to wear trousers. And there she is in her knickerbockers or breeches or whatever they would have called them at that point, and her padded jacket and her severe hairstyle. And that photograph is taken, it's quite an early photograph, from a sporting magazine. But of course at that period it was actually more common for magazines and journals not to have real photos in, but to have drawings which people had done. And if you've ever seen the Illustrated London News or the sketch, you'll know what I mean. And the next one is just such a drawing. Now this is Tupi on the right, defeating, on the left, the champion lady fencer of France. So this is England defeating France, and you'll see that Mamselle is clearly wearing a corset. We must remember this is a drawn thing, not a photograph, but she's very feminine in her presentation. She has a little frilly skirt, shorter than would have been worn in everyday wear, but a skirt nonetheless, and she's looking, Trey worried about the fact that she's about to be thrust through by our feisty Tupi on the right. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because I've just shown you what she actually looked like in her fencing gear, and this is what an artist made of it. She's much more shapely in this than she is in real life. She's got quite a lot of bust and a waist that looks like a corset, though it didn't particularly look as if she was wearing one in the photograph, did it? But nonetheless, she's being very forthright and downright, and she was obviously a very exciting person to go and watch, and she had a big following. As I say, you could get away with a sort of masculine garb if you were a top-class fencer. The next photo is the only picture that exists of Tupi on a horse. And at first glance, I think to the modern eye, it would be quite difficult to tell, wouldn't it, whether it were a man or a woman. Traditionally, from the 18th century onwards, a riding habit was, well, you know, the nearest you could get to dressing up as a bloke. And if you know anything about the ladies of Llancothren, for instance, they wore riding habits all the time, breakfast, dinner and tea, because that was their preferred garb. So there she is. That long coat makes it impossible for us to know whether she's wearing a skirt or breeches, but she's definitely riding astride, and she looks extremely smart, as does the horse. Beautiful horse. However, the other thing that Tupi was really well known for was tennis. So we'll have a look at her on the tennis court, and you really, really couldn't get away with anything but a long skirt in tennis. In fact, there was, at this period, which is probably the 1890s, there was a huge hoo-ha going on in the press about whether women should have to wear floor-length skirts to play tennis, or whether it would be appropriate for them to wear skirts were a little bit shorter above the ankle. I know, and it's what, 100 years ago? Yeah, so there we go. She is, however, wearing what looks to me like a collar and tie and cufflinks. So she's not exactly looking like the ladies with the flowered hats sitting round the tennis court, is she? And if you look at the next picture, you can see that skirt's not stopping her really going for it. Love that picture. Love the picture of the ancient tennis racket, apart from anything else. She wasn't as successful at tennis as she was at fencing, but she had a faithful following who followed her around the various European tournaments, and she did play in quite a lot of international matches, and was well known for that. She also drove fast cars and did all the things that a rich young woman who wanted to defy most things, including gender stereotypes, could do in the 1890s. This isn't Tupi, as you will immediately recognise. Who knows who these are? This is a picture on the right of Marguerite Radcliffe Hall, the author of The Well of Loneliness, known to her friends as John, and her equally well-known in certain circles partner, Una Lady Trowbridge. And I think you can see from the expression on Una's face that she was a right little pot of poison, wasn't she? We know all this stuff, not only because their lives have been brilliantly written up, by various biographers, but because Una kept a diary, very detailed diary of all goings-on, in which she was horrible about almost everybody, and which I will come to again later. What is probably slightly less well known, This is John and Mabel. Now, Mabel was Radcliffe Hall's partner before Una Troubridge came along. And I've brought her into the picture because it enables me to tell you a little story about Val's research methods. It's a good story, Val. It's because I admire you much and because you let me go with you to Chelsea. Do you remember that? Right, so here's another picture of Mabel. There we are, that'll do. Looking very much the English gentlewoman. She was married to an important and rich man called George, and she had her portrait painted several times by John Singer Sargent. So she moved in the most beautiful, and wore beautiful ball gowns and things. And then she went off with a woman called John. But there we go. So while we're looking at her, I'll tell you a little bit about the fact that she also kept diaries, but she was very nice about everybody in her diaries. In fact, I think probably she was too nice for her own good, wasn't she, Mabel? So Val said to me, I'm looking at what Tupi did in the First World War, and I know that at the end of the war she did this ambulance work, which we're going to come on to in a minute. But I don't know what she was doing in the first few years of the First World War. I can't place her anywhere. Now, she's bilingual in French. She could be doing anything. She could be behind the lines in France being a spy, for all we know. But we've got to check it out. We've got to check out to see if we can find out where she was. Now, Mabel Batten and Radcliffe Hall were very good friends of Tupi's. They socialised a lot. They all met up together in various German spas for their holidays. They went on country weekends, and Mabel writes in her diary what they all got up to, and she seems very fond of Tupi. So we thought if we'd go and look at Mabel's diaries, we might find out what Tupi was doing in that particular period of time. Now, Mabel's granddaughter, I think it was, is a lady called Cara Lancaster, and she lives in a very beautiful house in Chelsea. And she's actually the daughter of the cartoonist Osbert Lancaster. So her very beautiful whole house in Chelsea is stuffed to the gunnels with originals of his cartoons and other beautiful artworks and one thing and another. And she's quite used to people coming to look at Mabel's diaries. So when Val got in touch with her and we went along and she opened the door, she took us down into her basement kitchen where she'd got all Mabel's diaries in cardboard boxes on the kitchen table. And she said, just make yourselves at home, make yourself a cup of coffee, stay as long as you like. So we spent a day reading Mabel's diaries. Those of us who know a bit about this area of history know perfectly well that poor old Mabel was ousted from Radcliffe Hall's affections by the evil Una Troubridge. Well, by Una Troubridge anyway. And that Mabel then went into a decline and fairly soon died, and it was all a very, very sad story. But of course, as you write your diary day by day, you don't know what's going to happen in the future, do you? And I knew, and I was reading Mabel's diary, and it was saying things like, oh, my cousin Una came to lunch, and we all dined at so-and-so. And then a few days later, Una came to breakfast. And a few days after that, Una came to breakfast and stayed to lunch. And then John out with Una in the evening. And then John out all day looking at a flat that Una wants to buy. And so it went on. And I was getting actually really upset because I was reading this in this woman's handwriting. And you could tell she knew what was happening. I'd completely forgotten why we'd gone there. I'd completely forgotten about Tupi Lowther. And I was getting into this and thinking, oh God, this poor woman, I'm so upset. And Val, on the other side of the table, was just hacking through day after day of another diary. And just when we got to the stage where we were going to say, well, we're going to give up now and go home, we never found anything, Val said, got it! And there she was with her finger on a sentence, and it said, ran into Tupi Lowther outside Harrods. And of such little tiny moments and hours of nothingness are real historians' lives made, I have to say. And she'd found it, and she knew that Tupi Lowther was living in London at that point. And so we went home very happy. But it was a very memorable day for me, and I know all the various people that have been involved in going to various places with Val to look at her research have always had a good time. But that is very much about how Val works. She's not satisfied until she's got right to the bottom of the details. So I think it's time to actually talk about what happened in the First World War. here's Tupi in uniform of the French army, because, well, she's about 40 by now, so she's in her prime, and I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that in the work that she did with the ambulance unit in France in the First World War, she really found herself. It was who she was, it was who she wanted to be, and the photos show her, you'll see some of them in a minute, as confident and important and doing something, being somebody she really wants to be. What she did was that she put together with a woman called Nora Hackett, an ambulance service. She was rich, she had rich friends. So she first of all set about getting ambulances donated. So, you know, a rich lady would say, oh, I'll buy an ambulance. I can't remember how many there were, but there must have been a couple of dozen of them, do you think? Altogether, and they shipped them over to France. Nora Hackett set up the sort of rehabilitation and recreation side of things for the soldiers, and Tupi ran the ambulance unit. So she also needed to recruit a lot of drivers, and she was determined that they would all be women. So they became the only all-female ambulance unit in the war, and it took them quite a long time to get themselves accepted, and to get, this was the other thing that Tupi was very, very determined about, to get up to the front line, because there were plenty of women in field hospitals in other parts of France, but these were sometimes 30 or 40 feet from the front line when they finally got going. Eventually, they were accepted into the French army, and this man, looking slightly quizzical, turned out to be an absolute star. He's called Victor Chartanee. He was a lieutenant in the French army, and it was his job to look after this weird gang of English women. And he was at first a little bit overwhelmed by the whole idea. He was very impressed with the fact that Miss Lowther is the daughter of a lord, or the granddaughter of a lord, or whatever she was. And I don't think Tupi ever disabused him, actually, as to her family circumstances. But he also grew to hugely admire and to love the women who worked with her. In fact, at the end of the war, he married one of them, a girl called Barbara Sterling, whom he'd worked alongside, out front. She was one of the ambulance crew, and he and she both saw active service in the Second War, and Barbara ended up in Buchenwald, I think, didn't she? They had a really rough, exciting life together. So that's lovely, Victor. So we know for a fact that at least one of the ambulance drivers was straight. Neither Val nor I can remember where we've put the original of this, but it's a great big, like a school photo of all of them, and with the ambulances behind and a French chateau behind that. And you could be forgiven for thinking it was a Kenrick outing, basically, because you know, there's a way a girl wears a uniform, come on. So this is just a corner of it, which I happened to find on the internet today, because I did want to talk about it. And what you can't really see from this, because it's snatched out of the whole thing, is that these two girls down in the left-hand corner, the one on the far left has just taken the hand of the next one. She's grinning like anything, and the girl whose hand is being held is looking a bit self-conscious but smiling, and this is all going on while they're having their photo taken for the newspaper. And there are one or two other faces in there whose names we hear again after the war, and we know they belong to our community. So let's go on and get a better picture, just to remind you that in all the blood and gore, all the shelling and everything, there they are in their skirts and their long workman's coats, and they had not only to drive the ambulances and pick up the casualties and drive them back often under fire, they had to keep the ambulances going. So they were all well-trained mechanics, and each girl looked after her own ambulance, and it was down to her, spanner in hand, and it was a spanner job in those days, to make sure that every morning she made sure it was going to get through the day, and then she got out the crank handle and started it up. So there they are. I think that's a posed picture, but it's very clear that it's very near to the truth. One or two of the women wrote their memoirs after the war, and quite horrific, the circumstances in which they worked. This has become a very popular picture because I think people like to think that even in the horrors of war, a girl might spend time putting a couple of kittens in her helmet and looking after them and going, ah. But what do you know about lesbians and cats? I'll say no more. But it's a lovely picture anyway. Now this is special. Is that Nora on the right, or am I wrong? Unproven, okay, but it's definitely Tupi on the left. That's Tupi in command. But why I'm showing you this picture is that they're all wearing, with pride, and have painted on the side of the ambulances the Croix de Guerre. And at the end of the war, they were collectively awarded that very high medal from the French government for the service that they had done. And there they all are with the cross pinned to their uniforms. And here is the ceremony at which some very high up general in the French army gave them their medals, and there's Tupi standing out front, ready to receive the medal against the background of, I think, that same lovely chateau. We don't know where it was. And the ambulances drawn up behind, and the women waiting to be presented with their medals. So that's how the war ended, in glory. There's a Radcliffe Hall story which is less well known than The Well of Loneliness. It's a short story, and it's called Miss Ogilvy Finds Herself. Has anybody read it? Well, it tells the story. Radcliffe Hall didn't do anything in the First World War, by the way, but she wrote about it a lot. So it's a story about a woman who has never found herself at ease in the drawing room in which she was brought up, has never felt comfortable in frilly clothes, has never been able to wield a teapot and teacups in the sort of way that makes a good wife, but who at the beginning of the First World War finds herself in exactly the sort of work that Tupi and her friends had been doing. And it's very clear to anybody who knows this story that John actually based some of this story on what Tupi had told her about her experiences in France. But the story goes on to tell how Miss Ogilvy comes back from the war and doesn't know what to do with herself. She has been who she wanted to be, and now she's got to come back and be a clumsy, not very attractive, not very gender-conforming auntie in somebody else's drawing room. And she gets very depressed and very low. And there isn't actually a way out. So the end of the story is fantasy. The end of the story, she falls into a dream where she becomes a caveman. It's not very subtle, but it's quite sad. And she meets a lovely little lady, cave woman, and all is well. And at the very end of the story, she's found sitting, in this place where she's been having this dream, and she's died, but she's died happy because, as the story's just called, Miss Ogilvy Finds Herself. It sounds a naive and crass little story, but I think it says a lot about what happens when you've been an ambulance driver under fire in the First World War, and you come back to a society which, quite frankly, we cannot imagine. We think our society is gendered, but you have no idea. Nora Doan wrote a book about how people saw the women who worked in the war, in the First World War. And it's quite clear from the accounts that she's found and the newspaper articles and so on, that people were horrified. Not by the fact that sometimes the girls had to wear trousers or uniform, but horrified in a deep part of themselves about the fact that these girls were doing things that men did, and it wasn't right. And the story that, the song that you sing about masculine women and feminine men comes from that period, and it comes from that post-First World War thing. It was a real moral panic. Were women turning into men? Were men turning into women? And then as we move into the 20s, we get all that worry about lesbianism as well. So there's a lot going on sort of socially and culturally. So from being given the Croix de Guerre en France to living in Poulborough. It's not, you can see it might have been a little bit of a problem. But it brings us back to Tupi in Sussex. In fact, she lived in London after the war for quite a long time, but eventually she decided to move to Poulborough. By now it's the mid-30s, mid-1930s, and she decides to build herself a house. So she goes to stay in a nearby village called Coldwaltham for 2 or 3 years while the house is being built on the edge of Poulborough, and she builds this lovely Lowther Lodge. And it still stands there, and that was where she ended her days. Quite modern for it's got a 30s look, hasn't it, already? And I think she designed it. And it's another story about how Val does her research, because this time she took me and Marion, or rather, I think I was the driver and Marion was the moral support. And we drove out to Poulborough and we located this house. And Val says, "Stop here." So we streaked to a halt in a lay-by opposite the gate. And the gates are large and imposing, and they clearly are worked by, remote control, and they're clearly shut. And Val says, "No matter, we'll go in anyway." And off she rushes, and she pushes at the gate, which has been left unlocked. Presumably the owner was out, but we didn't know that at the time. The next thing we know is Val's halfway up the drive, and it's a long, imposing drive. You can't see that in the picture. And we're still hovering at the gate going, "Oh, we can't do this, can we?" Marion got back in the car, I think. And I thought, well, better not lose Val, she might get into trouble, so I followed her up the drive. And in fact, they were all out, so we had a jolly good nose around. Shouldn't say this, should we? Had a jolly good nose around, and the llamas on the lawn didn't mind us. They did look at us a bit odd. And so we're now quite well acquainted with Tupi's house that she built in Poulborough. So we're nearly at the end of the story. If we just go on, this is not a good photo, but I did want to put Fabienne in because she's very important. In the last years of her life, Tupi lived with and was particularly fond of this young woman called Fabienne, who was 25, 26 years younger than Tupi and was her goddaughter. And in her will, which she leaves large bequests to Fabienne, she describes her as my goddaughter. Fabienne was in fact the daughter of a friend of Tupi's, whom she probably met at school, because the friend became the headmistress of the school in France which Tupi attended. Gosh, we could do a whole history afternoon on Les Ruches, and the women who went to school there. We really could, and you think about how we network as gay and lesbian people. That school's got a lot to answer for. Anyway, the woman who became headmistress of it married a Frenchman, and Fabienne was their daughter, and she was Tupi's protégée, we'll say, in her later years. Now, this is another example of how Val doesn't jump to conclusions. Val says, why would she not get joy and delight in having the daughter of a dear friend, her goddaughter, with her in her later years, able to, be of mutual help to each other, and she was very fond of the girl. And that is all we know. It was not, however, how Una Lady Troubridge thought of it, and she wrote acidly. Una had caused a fairly major falling out between Tupi and Radcliffe Hall in the years after the war, to the extent to which Tupi does or doesn't figure under a nom de plume in the Well of Loneliness. But they fell out, and it was mainly about Una. Una wrote that the lovely Fabienne and Tupi were undoubtedly lovers, and how dreadful that was, and how a huge age range it was, and what a wicked old thing Tupi was. And she also wrote in her diary that Fabienne was an evil bitch as well, because she had a girlfriend of her own age who she had set up in a cottage, and how they were just waiting for Tupi to die so they could have all her money. So there's two versions of a story, and I leave you to decide which one was true. But Tupi did eventually leave a great deal of what she had to Fabienne, and she did love her very dearly, and Una was sometimes very horrible. So we'll leave it at that. Because it's Val, we're not going to say, and so she died and that's the end. because Val has discovered that 2P's name, at least, though very little fact about her, has lived on into the present day, and she figures as a character in this modern-day graphic novel, which comes under the heading of suffragitsu, and that's because the people who make these novels are interested in the idea that the suffragettes studied martial arts and self-protection and so on. And so they come up with suffragitsu, and they've written these extraordinary graphic novels, which are only available on the internet. In this one, 2P is seen as the driver driving Mrs. Pankhurst to a rally. I hasten to add that there is absolutely no suggestion, is there, that 2P was ever interested in the suffrage, but there she is. And in the next one, she's dressed as a man in the back of a lorry, and the guard is saying, "This man in the suit," and they're saying, "That's a woman actually, sir," and the guard is saying, "God save us." But it's all the imagination of the people writing the story. Though I have to say, Emmeline Pankhurst did have a very butch driver, but it wasn't 2P. That's the book that was produced with all this and much, much more in it. The picture on the front you will now recognise as England defeating France. And like the book about the hospitals, Val has brought a few of those along with her. Should anybody in the room not already have a copy of 2P Lowther Her Life, you can remedy that this afternoon. But just to say, I think you can tell what fun I've had out of Val's historical research, and the huge respect in which I hold it. And I even didn't say anything when Val said to me one day, I said, "Oh, I don't know all that stuff," and she said, "Well, that's because you're not a historian." Oh, I thought, okay, fine. That's all right. She's forgiven me and I've forgiven her. So I hope I've been able to give you a flavour of some of the joy she's brought to me, and to quite a lot of other people in this room. It's been just brilliant to be part of saying, well done, Val. We all love you.
Thank you, Jane. Hey.